The contentious move to raise salaries for members of parliament came into force this week. The Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority last month said members of parliament were set to get a salary boost of 2.7%, equating to just over £2,200. The decision has been widely denounced, with Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer saying the rise shouldn't go ahead, whilst families up and down the nation shoulder the impact of skyrocketing costs of living. And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, urged the authorities to show restraint. Well, I'm going to ask Paul and Arlene their views on this, because clearly I have a very vested interest in the answer to this one. Arlene, this is something that's done by an independent body, isn't it? And yet it's the politicians that seem to get stick for it. You'll have known this from your time in office.
Yeah, and I mean, I do recall when politicians set their own pay levels, and there was a whole hue and cry about that because that seemed to be unfair. You should be setting your own pay. Totally understandable. So it was handed over to an independent body, and that's the case for all of the devolved administrations as well, as I understand it. So you can't have it both ways, I'm afraid. If you hand it over to an independent body and they decide that there should be a pay rise, just as the independent body that looks into nurses' pay decides that there should be a pay rise, then that is what is happening. But I mean, I have to say, announcing it or actually having it put into force on the same day as everybody's having an increase in their energy bills, their council tax bills, their water bills, their everything else was really, really bad timing and looks really, really bad, I have to say, Deanna. And I know, people will say MPs shouldn't really be paid anything at all. I mean, if you want to get people, and I can say this now because I'm out of politics, if you want to get people of ability into politics, then you have to pay them for that, because they're not only walking away from their private lives, they're now in the public spotlight, they're serving people of their constituency, so they should be properly paid. So it may not be very popular, but I think it's actually right that an independent body does set the pay rate. And, it then also allows politicians like Sir Keir Starmer to say, this is awful, this has nothing to do with me, it's somebody else's fault. Whereas actually it was he and others that give the independent body the right to set the pay.
Mm-hmm. Paul, what's your take?
Well, I have no problem with the idea of an independent body regulating MPs' pay. It just seems to me that the independent body for MPs is a lot more generous than independent bodies for other groups of workers. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I mean, I remember the big one, of course, back in 2015, I think it was, where MPs were given an 11% pay rise, and that caused all sorts of controversy at the time. And look, I'm not somebody who says MPs are a bunch of narcissists. They're in it for themselves. That none of them are any good. I think actually.
Here, Paul.
No offence intended, of course. But I think the vast majority of MPs do a difficult and challenging job. And I don't mind if they travel first class on the train rather than second class and stuff like that. But the optics are just not good. And particularly when you consider that many people in the public sector have had pretty paltry pay increases over the last 14 years. We've had a period of austerity where people in the public sector have had pay freezes or 1% and 2% and whatever. And when they see MPs getting something more generous, it's understandable that they take umbrage to that. And people, people in the private sector as well, people who are suffering as a result of the cost of living crisis, they think, well, actually, you're getting a fair whack this year, and I'm not. And that's the reality. So it's not MP's fault necessarily, but someone has to be held accountable, I think, for the fact that MPs' pay increases tend to be more generous than everybody else's.
Against that backdrop, last year there was no increase in pay for MPs. IPSA were going to give out a pay rise. There was so much kickback given what was going on with COVID that they decided to scrap that. So this is the first one in a few years. But I will admit, even as a Member of Parliament, I think usually if you read in the news that you were getting a pay rise in any normal walk of life, you'd be punching the air and cheering. I saw it pop up on Sky News and just groaned because I knew what my inbox would be full of. And actually, in the context of what is going on, I think you're exactly right, both of you, that the optics of this are really not good. But Arlene, you do make a really good point there. And this is something that I've said long before I actually became an MP myself. It is important that we pay MPs properly. We don't want to be overly generous. But if some people have said they should be paid the minimum wage or whatever. As you rightly said, Arlene, we need to get the best and the brightest and the most talented people into this, because they're setting legislation, they're shaping the entire country. And unfortunately, what we would see if we had really low pay for MPs is that it'd be the rich folk who do it as a hobby because they can afford to do it rather than necessarily the brightest and best getting into it, wouldn't it?
Yes, and I think that has been the problem because, of course, in the past, MPs way back in history weren't paid. That's why that's why Parliament sat at 2:30 to allow people to go to court in the morning and earn their pay, and then come as a sort of a hobby to the Houses of Parliament. I mean, the whole point about having a wage that is appropriate is that it doesn't matter where you come from, what your background, you're coming into Parliament, you're getting paid the same as the next person in the next constituency. And I think that that is absolutely right because, of course, in the past, Parliament was a place for those people from the upper classes, people who were well paid, people who had family fortunes, etc., etc. So if it is to be more representative, then you have to properly pay people, and you want people coming in. And sometimes I hear this in Northern Ireland, why in heaven's name would you get involved in politics? It's such an awful job. And look at what you get paid. You could be making twice as much in the private sector. Why would you do it to yourself? So we need to have people of ability coming forward into politics if we want to have a good representative democracy and if we want people to make legislation that they can stand over. So, it's an unpopular thing to argue, but I think we need to pay our politicians an appropriate wage.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, do you think it's good optics, or do people see through it as cynical when a leader of a party actually refuses a pay rise or pushes back against it?
No, I mean, I think some MPs probably do have a genuine belief that this isn't the right thing at the moment. You know, when other people across the country are really suffering in terms of no pay rises and a cost of living crisis, then is it right morally for me to take this increase? I suspect a lot of MPs probably do wrestle with their conscience on that issue. And there's probably, let's be honest, there's probably a bit of politicking going on as well. But I think there's a balance to be struck on the broader point about MPs' pay. Of course, pay them too much and they will become out of touch with the lives of ordinary people and the stresses and strains that confront ordinary people in their everyday lives. Pay them too little, and there's a chance that you don't attract the brightest and the best, which is obviously what we want in Parliament. So I'm not opposed at all to MPs earning a reasonable salary. I think, to be fair to them, lots of MPs could probably earn a lot more out there in the big wide world than they do in Parliament. So they often make a financial sacrifice by going into Parliament. But, you have to take cognizance of the fact that at the moment, people are living in straitened times. It's a really difficult economic financial situation for millions of families across the country. They don't like the idea of the MPs getting bigger pay rises than everybody else. It's really that simple.
Mm-hmm. Well, send us your views, gbviews@gbnews.uk.